Okay, so the first effect I'm going to talk to you about today is a dynamics control. And this is about controlling the volume, the dynamic range of something. So we have like, here you see, let's say this is dialogue. Here you have the peak amplitude, which is like the ceiling, it's 0. And we're not going to call it the noise floor, we'll just call it the lowest amplitude, which is 0. Okay, and there's some lower passages in here that maybe a little bit of a script was read too quietly, and then it's like really loud in the microphone. Now, you could go in afterwards into Reaper, and as you've seen, you could take a pencil tool and do this, or you could put little dots in by hand, or you could, instead of entering all these points, you could use the automation I showed you about the latch, touch, right? That's great. That's a perfectly valid way to go about using this, creating dynamics control. But it's going to be really tedious if you're doing this for, say, 1,000 voice takes, or like maybe you have 20,000 lines of dialogue that are in 10 languages. There's no way you're just going to waste a lot of time doing it this way. A better solution is to use a plugin that will do all the kind of heavy lifting for you. And in this case, it's called a compressor. And a compressor is a tool that's going to turn down volume depending on where we want it to be, how much we want it to be turned down when the signal gets too loud. And another bonus is that it has a feature where we can also turn the volume up when everything gets too quiet. So you're essentially bringing up the lows and turning down the highs and making the dynamic range less of a value. All right. So you had this in the darker area here. You see the original clip. And then we applied some moderate compression, medium amount of compression, and you get something like this. And that's beautiful. Why are we doing this? Well, I mean, it's not just for the sake of making it less dynamic. It's because we want the speech to be audible. And especially in game audio, where we have all these real-time mixes. We've got music going and sound effects, and we can try to predict how all this audio is going to play out, but we can't always be certain. And if we have dialogue in our game, we want to make sure it cuts through. I'm sure you've watched like, or DSP, digital signal processing, Stanley. You can just we're just going to call them effects. You can call them plugins. It's all kind of the same, in the same category. Okay, just a way to manipulate audio. And in this case, it's dynamics control. We're changing the volume. Okay. And so I'm sure you've watched like Hulu, Netflix, or something, your favorite original programming, and someone's talking and the music's suddenly too loud and you're like, I can't understand what they're saying. You go back 16 times, you put closed captioning on. That happens from time to time. And or sometimes you'll be watching something and your TV setting has some weird, audio selection you made for, like, if you're watching sports or you're watching movies, and who knows what the algorithm for that is. But anyway, this is an important thing. We want speech to be audible, or you may want to have dynamics control in music. Oftentimes, you may have an instrument that's too loud, or a certain set of frequencies even that you want to control, and we can do that here with compression. Okay, if I had more compression on it, I can keep cranking it up. We're approaching what I call a brick wall. And it actually is called brick wall limiting. We call it limiting for short in this case. This would be about 10 times the original signal. There is no formal point where something becomes a compressor and then suddenly becomes the limiter. This is just an industry term. It's not a scientific term, but usually it means once we get beyond 10 times the original signal, or squashing it down severely, we call it limiting. As you can see here, that would be pretty good. And I want to show you what that sounds like. But before I do, I want to introduce you to a plugin called the compressor. All right. So this is what it's going to look like. Cosmetically, it is a little different than the one you will have in version 5 or 6. They keep tweaking the cosmetic look of it, but the controls are exactly the same, and they're in the same position. There's really only 2 things I would like you to know today. There's so much to go over. It's like you look at this and you might be thinking, oh my gosh, how am I going to figure this out in like one day? Don't worry about it. There are whole books written about compression. There are whole courses on dynamics control. You could never learn it all in one day. But I'm going to show you a couple of controls on here that are very important. So again, like landing a plane, you see, the pilot's passed out. It's up to you to land the plane. You see all these switches and knobs and dials, but then you realize, okay, deep breath. actually, I only need like a couple of these knobs and dials because the rest of them are for some other purpose. So I can just zone in on those and land the plane, right? So that's what we're going to do here. So the very first control parameter I'd like you to know about is called the threshold. And this is the volume we're going to activate the compressor. We're going to turn this thing on. Remember, this is a device that's going to turn down the volume when it gets too high. We're going to make this up, the settings here. So I turn this down to a value at minus 24.5. And what that's going to mean is as my audio is playing along, I realize, okay, it's pretty quiet, but then there's this loud point. And the moment the audio crosses minus 24.5, as soon as it's louder than that, the compressor is going to turn on and do something. What's it going to do? Well, it's going to turn the volume down. And the next question is by how much? And that is the ratio. All right, this is how much we're going to reduce the dynamic range by, how much we're going to compress the audio. And there's an input to output ratio here. In this case, I've set it to 5:1. It's like a kind of a moderate compression. And so what this means is, and this is the most math in the course, I promise. What this means is you've got minus 24.5. Anything that goes beyond minus 24.5 is going to be compressed by this ratio. So for every 5 decibels I go over this value, I'm going to bring everything down 1 decibel. And that stacks up. Okay, so what's happening is the larger the ratio, the more compression you're going to have. All right. And the best way I can show this to you is by listening to it. So let's go ahead and go inside of Reaper and give it a listen. All right. Let's see. Let me find somebody to use this on. Let's try. Whoops. Okay, this is a Solar Wizard from Wartide. This is raw dialogue. This isn't the finished product. And I purposely changed the volumes internally and re-exported this for the sake of example. Imagine I have some voice. Turn this down. And now this is some crazy incantation going on. The Solar Wizard's kind of this character he has these various incantations and creates different spells. And so some kind of mock foreign language here. Here we go. All right, that's nice. All right, beautiful. And then now that was kind of quiet in comparison to the other two. What if I wanted to bring these down and kind of bring this up? Well, I can apply a compressor. So I'll click on the effects button. Let's just pretend this isn't here for a second. This is one of the compressors, but I can click add, and you'll see, and you've done this probably before with the cave ambience. Maybe you tried the reverb option, and you'll see all these crazy. I mean, look at all this stuff. Now you won't have all of these. I have some from my commercial work, freelance work, and I have different plugins that I use. But you'll have a lot of these. Reaper has its own set. Anything that starts with REA is a Reaper plugin. So if I type in, if I just type in comp for compressor, see what I get. I got a few things here. Oh, here it is, VST recomp. There. So I'll select that, click add, and you can have multiple instances of the same plugin. It's not common, but if you had to for some reason, you could. I've already got it here, so I'm just going to remove it. All right, and let me listen to this one more time. I'll just start here. That's some kind of spell, and then all right, let's see what happens when I apply a compressor. Now I'm setting my threshold to minus 50. That is super duper compression. Okay, the threshold at minus 50, that means anything that's louder than minus 50, which is pretty much everything except for silent passages and maybe like this down here. Anything that's louder than minus 50, turn on the compressor and do what? Make it compress the dynamic range at an 8:1 ratio. That's pretty moderate to almost high. That's almost high compression. You're bordering on limiting at this point. What does that sound like? Let's turn it on and watch this. Whoops, hang on. But it should not have sounded like that. This is what it'll sound like. Very quiet. But look at the meter on this red meter. Instead of going from the bottom to the top, Going from top to bottom. This is the amount of compression that's being applied, which is insane. It's like, but if you were to hear this at a high volume, you'd notice that everything is about the same power level, the same dynamic range. Okay, and there's a little button down here I didn't talk about called makeup. It says auto makeup. A lot of compressors, a lot of plugins, and if you're in a recording studio, if it's physical hardware that was a compressor in some racked space with other equipment, it may have a dial on it called makeup. And that is just a volume knob, basically, makeup gain. So I'm going to click on this, and it's going to automatically turn the volume up for me to the peak amplitude, like the highest it can bring it up for me, just so I can hear it, because it's so quiet. I've squashed it so much, you can't hear it. So let's put the makeup button on, the gain, and now let's listen to it. Now I can really hear that. But do you hear? Can you hear the squashed component? It's really. I'm doing this just to be, for the sake of example here, just kind of like a very exaggerated compression. But you can see how much it's going down. I could have something not as dramatic. Oops. There's a little bit of compression here. Pull it down a little bit more. There we go. There's no magic formula to apply, except it's a matter of taste. But you do want to have a dynamic range that will probably cut through a mix pretty well. So oftentimes with dialogue, we tend to use a moderate or even a high level of compression. So let's go ahead and take a look at that again. So we have a threshold when we activate the compressor, how much we reduce the dynamics by in decibel, right? We call that limiting if it's more than 10 to 1. There's something I didn't tell you about. Yes, these slides have been posted, Stanley. They're in the Google Drive, and there'll be a video commentary. I'm recording this, but there'll be a video version of it maybe later today. Okay, and I'll let everybody know about that when it comes up. So we have something called a low pass and a high pass filter here, and a lot of plugins will have this. And this basically says, well, maybe you don't want to compress everything from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. Maybe you want to have a range. Now, we're not going to be using this for other particular exercise, but you have the option of selecting a window of frequencies you'd like to compress. So, I don't want anything less than 168 hertz compressed, and I don't even have the high pass filter turned on yet, but that's an option if you want it, okay? Most effects will have something called a wet and a dry mix. The wet mix is a silly term. It means how much of the effect you're going to hear in the mix. And this quote unquote effect is really more of just a processor. And so I want to hear it, the whole thing. So I'm going to leave this alone. It's just at the nominal amount. I'm not adding or subtracting any volume here. And the dry mix is the original signal. Now in this case, I don't want to hear the original signal. I don't want to hear the unaffected voice. I want to hear just the output. So I've got wet on and dry off, and I don't even have to touch this because this is already set up for you. But I just want you to know you can make adjustments here for future plugins, which we'll see in a little bit. All right, so this is a lot of extra stuff. You only need to know about the threshold and the ratio today, and I just showed you that.